They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
All right, welcome back to Best Day Ever Media. This is episode number 21, and it's a Monday, which means we're talking personal finances and professional development. And today we're going to be talking all about real estate investing. And this is going to be more of a introduction to the various strategies that I think are most commonly deployed, and a few insights into how you may want to consider deploying these strategies for yourself as a follow-up to last week's episode on financial independence and retiring early. You may also be familiar with some of the earlier episodes we've done on Mondays, including the SMART Goals episode and the 4 Disciplines of Execution. And I would strongly recommend watching all 4 of these videos, almost like a series, because I do believe that a large part of successfully executing these strategies is going to come down to really understanding the principles covered in those videos so that you can set out and have a very clear path to where you are and where you want to go. And I think that's largely going to be an overarching theme throughout here. So throughout this discussion, I want Matt and I to cover with you guys just a few strategies and tactics related to real estate investing, and perhaps some of the things that you might not be considering right now. Some of you might be thinking, well, I don't have a ton of cash. How could I possibly get started? Well, I was able to start real estate investing with very, very little capital as well. Some of you might have a lot of skills, right? You might be already working with your hands, working in a contracting job or doing some of these elements for yourself. And some of you may just have some capital and have no desire at all to get your hands dirty. And I think there's some valid strategies for that as well. But before we get started, Matt, good morning. And I just wanted to just kind of start off here and just kind of just hear what's your perspective on real estate investing. Like, obviously you were successful as a real estate investor. What got you started in real estate investing? Why did you choose that versus any other asset class or investing strategy?
Yeah, I'll summarize quickly here the story because I've shared it a few times on other platforms. But essentially, in university, myself and one of my roommates in last year of university, so my 4th year, we both knew we wanted to be rich, but we didn't know how to get rich, and so we entertained a lot of different ideas. At one point in time, we tried to set up an import export business with like CDs and blank DVDs from China. And then we found out there was like a import tax that was like just crazy, right? Because of the subsidies that the Canadian government provides to the music industry, which that's a conspiracy for a whole nother day. But as we kind of ran into some of these problems, finally I was just like, yo, Jake, go ask your dad. He owned a really large manufacturing plant and was very financially successful. Probably at that point in my life, like his dad was probably the richest person I'd ever like knew of or like what had one degree of separation from. So he went and asked his dad, and his dad gave us some book recommendations, and I think actually like gave Jake the books. And so it was Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the Wealthy Barber. And so those books absolutely changed the financial trajectory of my personal life. And in particular, Rich Dad, Poor Dad stood out because it looked like it broke down real estate in such a manner where it felt like a formulaic process that you didn't necessarily need to have a massive competitive advantage at in order to be able to become financially successful. That would lead me down a rabbit hole of different research, reading all kinds of sort of different personal development and real estate oriented books. Now, again, it probably took me almost another 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years. I forget what age you are when you graduate university, but probably at least 3 or 4 years before I actually executed and bought my first rental property. But the reason that I was so attracted to real estate, other than the fact it seemed formulaic, was it also seemed like big. So it seemed like a very big niche to kind of carve off. And obviously, there's like subsets of niches in regards to real estate investing, but I like the simplicity, right? I could build out a financial model. I felt very confident that there was demand or customers for the product I was going to be providing. And again, it felt like with the first few rental properties I bought, they were student rentals, which was a niche where I was recently just a student. My business partners were previously students as well. So we felt we understood that market to a certain extent. And when we ran the numbers in our spreadsheet, it didn't feel like there was a lot of variables. Where in a lot of different other businesses, like, trying to predict stock markets or set up a real business, not that real estate's not a real business, but, a more traditional business outside of real estate, how many widgets were you going to sell? How much does it cost to make a widget? How do you market widgets? All those things felt so much more intimidating. So for me personally, it felt like the path of least resistance towards consistent financial success. And that's really what brought me into real estate and made me make it the primary pillar of my financial independence.
Yeah, I would completely share the same story with you about Rich Dad Poor Dad and The Wealthy Barber. I think those were two of the first books that made it very clear that it was important to sort of take control of your time. It was important to be a business owner. It was important to have assets. It was important to have savings. And one of the things that you've talked about a lot, we covered actually in the fire episode, is like covering that cost of your shelter. If 30 to 40% of your income's going towards that shelter every month, like it's very hard to go and make just like go out and make 30% more money, right? And so one of the best
Mhm.
about how do I retain that 30% is to think about just saving it in general. And so that's what really inspired me with my first property when I was getting started to house hack, right? Which was a strategy I'd honestly never heard of until I came across it with you and your channel on the Canadian Real Estate Channel talking about eliminating that actual cost from your outlay. And for me, like this concept I was familiar with when going to school, right? Like that's kind of how we did it as students, is like everybody would just rent a room and that allowed us to all share the cost of what would otherwise be a far too expensive living situation. But the idea of doing that after school was sort of foreign to me and some of the strategies related to that. So it was definitely very helpful for me in my first property to not only get my seller to finance the property for me, but to also be able to live there for free. And I was actually even able to profit a little bit on top of that just by renting out the rooms on Airbnb as a short-term rental strategy. But that's getting a little bit more complicated, I think, than what we need to for the purpose of this discussion. And what I wanted to cover in this discussion is just like the more broader sense of like what strategies are even available to us. And one of the reasons I wanted to cover that is, when I was growing up, my grandparents, my grandfather worked as a welder, my grandma worked as a Canadian Tire store manager, right? So these are not the two jobs that you think of when you think, oh, okay, they're going to be millionaires. But real estate was able to do that for them, right? They were able to buy a property. And of course, this was over a lot of time and some aggressive mortgage paydowns on their behalf. But they were able to buy a house in Collingwood for 160,000, I believe, and that has since appreciated to well over $1 million. And when they actually go to sell that property as their primary residence, it will be tax free. So interesting strategy for a welder and a Canadian Tire store manager to go from making maybe 30, 40, $50,000 a year to becoming millionaires at the end of their career paths, right? And so I was always really interested in this, but it turns out that the strategies that we're going to cover today are some ways that actually allow this to become more of a repeatable and, like you mentioned, formulaic approach so that we can potentially get this done without having to wait until our 60s or 70s to enjoy the benefits. So the first strategy I wanted to cover, Matt, and I'd be very happy to get any of your input along the way here, is the actual BRRRR method. So if you guys aren't aware yet, I'm not sure how you got this far, but we do post all of these articles in our Substack. Okay, so the things I'm about to talk about today are available to you completely for free on our Substack. We also have comments enabled so that you guys can become contributors to the conversation. So please jump onto our Substack, leave us some comments about any questions that you have or anything that you want to add to this. But what I wanted to cover first was sort of the BRRRR method. And Matt, I had never heard of this strategy before I ran into you and your channel. And there's actually a great video series that I have linked here below in the resources called BRRRRing Elias Street. And I believe this is a 4-part series, Matt, or maybe it's
5.
It's a 5-part series where Matt actually shows you and walks you through some of the renovations that we're about to discuss so that you actually have like a tangible sort of example of what this might look like. And so the BRRRR strategy, what that actually stands for is to buy, okay? So ideally we're going to buy a property that's in disrepair or under market value. And we might do that through a series of ways. We might put free ads up on Kijiji advertising that you're looking for a property. This might be working with a member of your power team, like a real estate investor centric real estate agent, or this might be by going out and just putting boots on the pavement and door knocking in your neighborhood and looking for a property, or another strategy called driving for dollars, where you're intentionally going and talking to the people that own houses that are visibly in disrepair. Okay, I'm talking about those houses in your neighborhood that have the tarp on the roof, or the vehicle that's derelict in the front yard, or overgrown landscaping and things like that. We're going to be looking for signs and strategies to give us the most chances we can in order to buy a house that is under market value. Okay. And what's under market value? Well, market value is essentially what it would sell for as is on the market right now if it was to every using something like the multiple listing service or the MLS. So one of our strategies to make money in this throughout this strategy is to just have a better buy, right? It is often said, or there's an old adage that like your money's made on the buy. And I do agree. I do agree with that to a certain extent. So if you can buy a property that is under market value by targeting assets that are in disrepair or that you can add strategic value to by doing these types of renovations, you will maximize your chances of profit. Okay. And I think that profit's not ever a given or a guarantee, but we can always work to maximize our chances of profit by buying correctly. Okay. So I think even just to preface this conversation, you guys will always want to consult your power team. And I regard your power team as sort of your mortgage agent, your real estate agent, your real estate lawyer, and your accountant. And then if we're going to get into renovations and things like that, you should also have some contractors if you're not the one that holds all these skills, right? To just let you in on what should these renovations cost if everything goes to plan. And then I would generally plan on it being a little bit more than that because the estimates are never quite correct. But, your power team is going to be a very important part of all of these strategies. And you want to consult them before you purchase any assets like this, because we're often talking here about hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, in terms of debt obligation. So buying right is definitely the path to making the most out of your chances of profit. The next stage in the BRRRR method would be to renovate. And I've listed here some of the strategic renovations that I think are really important. So one of the things that you can do in terms of a strategic renovation would be adding bedrooms. Generally speaking, regardless of the strategy you're doing, more heads in beds is going to be resulting in more profit for you. So if you can add bedrooms, you're adding to your potential list of buyers. Okay. So, if it's a 1-bedroom and you make it a 2-bedroom, well, now instead of just being a single parent or a couple, you can have people that have kids, or you can have 2 different people renting one spot. And of course, with the BRRRR method, we're actually talking about renting it out after this. So the more opportunities for renters to look at your property and take it into consideration as a viable option for them, the more odds that you can increase that rent. So adding bedrooms is going to be important. Generally speaking, when we're doing these renovations, we do want to take into consideration the neighborhood or the area that we're purchasing in. And we want to be looking at things that have also recently rented out or that are on the rental market. So one of the things that we want to avoid is either over renovating or under renovating. And both are completely possible. And there is a spot. And I know that sounds a little bit amorphous, but I promise you, you can over renovate and you can definitely under renovate. So it is definitely important to research your area. You know, what do the tenants in that area expect? Are they expecting luxury vinyl plank flooring? Are they expecting the bathrooms to be updated? Or is this more of a neighborhood that is more of a value centered neighborhood where they really just want a place to live, and they're willing to rent a place that doesn't have the bathrooms updated? But one of the things we need to consider is, how do we maximize the rent and how do we maximize our refinance when we go to pull our capital out of these buildings? So you want to take all that into consideration. And one of the ways to do that is by looking at the comparable units in your area, both from a sales perspective and from a rental perspective. So renovating bathrooms is often one of the best ways to maximize your rent, because it has everything to do with sort of the user experience, right? Your renter is going to be emotional about the place that they live in, more likely than not, right? And having a great bathroom is one of the ways you can both maximize your refinance as well as maximize your rent. So I always recommend doing the bathrooms. Generally speaking, you know, the bathroom upgrades are not even that expensive. Like, they're way cheaper than you might think. Like, the vanities can be found for very, you know, there's great value in upgrading the vanities. They're not that expensive. Lighting isn't that expensive either, and it's a great way to maximize value. And then when we're talking about the actual showers and stuff like that, tiling, actually not that expensive for the visual appeal that you get from it, and from the utility perspective that you could get from removing some of the old school shower and tub surrounds. So I always believe in renovating the bathrooms. And while you're doing that, just be aware that, like, you know, you may as well build it to last. So I'm talking like green board, red guard, things like that. Like, think of how a renter is going to use your bathroom, not how you might ideally use it. So waterproofing things is going to be important. The next thing that I always recommend is doing the kitchens. Okay, cabinets, making sure that you have ground fault circuit interrupters on all of your countertops and stuff like that, so that there's no possibilities of fires or electrocution or anything like that. That's going to be important. But the kitchen's like kind of the biggest like wow factor inside, I find. So like, kitchens and bathrooms are like where all of that emotional connection comes from, right? So kitchen's definitely going to be important to upgrade. Flooring, I find it has a massive visual appeal and effect on the building, as well as a utility appeal as well. So if you're putting something in like a luxury vinyl plank, this might run you $1.99 or maybe $2.50 a square foot. But what it's going to do for you is allow you to have a very durable and waterproof product on the floor that's also pet proof, right? It's pretty hard to damage those types of flooring. And it really just kind of bulletproofs your spot and helps you get a better refinance. Lighting, this is another cheap and excellent way to improve the quality of your building as well as its visual appeal. And then paint. I mean, paint is just obvious. Like, if you can brighten up the space, make it look a little bit more roomy, I think it's much more likely to get rented, and it just looks better in photos. So you're gonna have better chances with your advertising. One thing that is elective, I would say, but is something I would always consider, is just the curb appeal. Like, if it's a smaller building, like a single family house or a duplex, triplex, I would always consider at least looking at the landscaping. Like, what does it look like from the outside? Does it look like the type of place somebody maximizing rent would want to live? Does it look like the type of place an appraiser is going to want to give a high value to? And so a lot of people don't really think about the landscaping, but I do think it is important to some people, and it could certainly help you to maximize your rent. Matt, is there anything you wanted to add here to strategic renovations?
I think one of the big things when it comes to strategic renovations is simply being able to spot the opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So, and then understand how to get, particularly if you're getting started off, you know, you maybe have certain financial constraints or limitations, finding like, you know, how to get the same sort of quality, maybe on a smaller budget, right? So oftentimes when I first got into this, if we were updating the kitchen, I'd much rather go to a used appliance store that also has a warranty associated with it and buy a used set of appliances that look like new and have them in that apartment versus going out and dropping top dollar on appliances. And there's a lot of different similarities with like other aspects to your renovation budget that you can execute on a similar manner. Now, this isn't about cutting corners. This is just really understanding what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And that's the biggest aspect here about bringing a property up to its highest, best, most efficient use. Understand that every property doesn't need like a granite countertop, right? So like, will that actually get you the right ROI from it? Or will simply like a nice, clean, new, like laminate or veneer or whatever do the same sort of job? And oftentimes the answer is like, yes. It's more about cleanliness and looking like fresh versus having to look like top of the line, particularly for the sort of properties that at least I use as like entry level properties. And I suspect a lot of individuals will start on the lower rungs of the investment ladder. So you're probably going to be looking more to starter homes, starter apartments, and things of that nature. And again, you don't necessarily need to spend top dollar to get the same results.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And we're wrapping up a project right now, actually, where we're just about to get appliances and all that stuff delivered. And one of the interesting things that we've found and we've leveraged now in several properties is scratch and dent stores. Because if you go to these stores, if you can walk through and see their inventory, right? When you say scratch and dent, I think people maybe have like the wrong idea. It's like these appliances aren't destroyed. It's like, no, they got nicked, right? They got nicked on delivery, or they got nicked on a wall or on the floor or something like that when they were taking it out of the box. And so if you walk through some of these stores, you can get appliances that are top of the line. I mean, like, Samsung, LG, like brands that you would say are like kind of premium appliances, but somehow they got a nick or a scratch on them while they were being delivered. And so they were sent back. And what the stores do is they give them off to these sort of wholesaling companies that sell them later. And you can walk through. And the last fridge we bought, like it was going against the wall in kind of like a little nook. And so the scratch that was on it, first of all, it was like the most minimal scratch I've ever seen, but it was also going to be hidden inside this little nook anyways. And so it literally didn't matter. But that appliance now was 40% off, right? So like, it's a great strategy to at least consider all of your options, right? Now, if you're going absolute top of the line, this is like, the best neighborhood ever, maybe you can't get away with this. But if you're going to be renting in some of the neighborhoods that we're used to, where it's sort of a B plus kind of neighborhood, like there's no point in spending 100% when you could spend 60% and get the same product. So definitely want to shop around. And I guess one point to add to any of these renovations would be to get multiple quotes. Right. This is something that we found to be very useful, to get at least 3 quotes on any job, because quotes are typically free, but the difference in cost and difference in quality or guarantee is often very different. So we've had quotes that might be 20, 30% different. Right. And what that might look like is they're either using different materials that are inappropriate for your scope, or they're on a different timeline or a different skill set. And I do find sometimes that like paying for the right labor is important, but you should also shop around and get an idea of what's out there. And the other thing to add is like when we're talking about bathroom updates or kitchen updates, flooring, lighting, landscaping, a lot of this stuff, paint especially, a lot of this stuff you can do yourself if you really have to. So that's another strategy, is like all of these things are available for you online. I know when I first did a little bit of a learning curve with Matt, like he was just like, yep, YouTube University, right? I was laying flooring and he's like, YouTube's your best friend. Right. And honestly, you can probably learn 80% of what you need to know just by going through YouTube and watching some of these videos and instructional things on how to do this stuff. That doesn't mean you need to do it yourself, but I think it's still a good idea to go through and watch, right? Like go watch how a bathroom should be tiled. Go watch how your kitchen cabinet should be installed, and that will give you more ammunition when you're actually talking to the contractors that you want to use, in order to just have a good understanding. Like, are they giving it to you straight, or are they telling you something that you want to hear? And I think that that's a useful strategy as well to consider. I didn't mention here, but adding additional units is definitely a great way you could add rent. But I think that's I think there's a bit of a disconnect between like what actually needs to happen to add an additional unit legally for some people, like there's a lot of consideration when it comes to fire, safety, permits, things like that. So you definitely want to consult your power team if you're considering adding additional units, but that would obviously be a way that you could maximize your rent. And another strategy that might be relevant for you guys right now is you've probably noticed that the cost of gas and hydro has gone up recently. And generally speaking, it can make sense to split the utilities if you have multiple units on your property. So if you're looking at a duplex, for example, and it's all on 1 meter, typically the landlord's going to be paying for the utilities. The issue with that is you get people that are perhaps inconsiderate that you're paying for these things. And so they start using them in different ways and they change their consumer behavior. And so, the typical situation of this is like, it's midwinter, the furnace is running on high, but the window is open so that their cat can go inside or outside or whatever, or the window's open so they can get fresh air in the house, but your furnace is running. And so splitting utilities is often a great way to take that cost off of yourself and get a little bit more consumer awareness from your actual tenant. And so that sort of covers the renovation stage. You basically want to do your kitchens, bathrooms, flooring, landscaping, lighting, and paint. Add any bedrooms that you can and consider splitting utilities. Then we've got the rental side of things. So the basic concept here is we buy a property that's in disrepair. We do these strategic renovations. And at that point, we should be able to rent the building out for higher than what we would have been able to before we did those renovations, right? So you took a building that perhaps was maybe in a hoarding situation, or maybe it was just hasn't been updated for decades, or maybe it just hadn't been looked after properly, and we clean it up, right? We make it look fresh, we make it look bright, we make it look open. We've added some utility for our potential tenants. Now we've got to show this thing and rent it out. When we go to rent it out, we're obviously going to try and use some best practices for that. And I think best practices for renting your unit is going to be a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but certainly there's lots of information on this available to you online. But generally speaking, I would just advise you that depending on where you live, you really want to be taking into consideration that the person that you're going to put in your building. Because if you're like me and you live in Ontario, it's very difficult to have takebacks on this. Okay. Once you put somebody in your unit, they're going to be there potentially for a long time. Okay. So I've got a building right now that has had the same tenant for 10 years in the one unit. And he's paying about $465 per month, where the market rent on that unit is about $2,000 per month. So that's a big gap. And with Ontario, we've got price controls, right? We can only raise the rent this year. I think it's 2.5% in January. So when we're looking at something like that, like at least you want the tenant to be great, right? If they're going to be paying you $1,600 less than what market rent would be, you at least want them to be a great tenant. So just take that into consideration when you're going to rent it out. And then the real magic of the BRRRR method comes at the next stage, the next R, which is refinance. So once we've actually bought it, renovated it, and rented it out at this new higher rate, it opens us up to the opportunity to refinance the property. And when we're refinancing, generally speaking, and now is kind of a strange time as we're recording this, where like interest rates are going really high. The real estate market has taken a large hit in terms of value. And generally speaking, capital is getting a little bit more hard to find. So right now, you may be expecting a refinance of about 75%, right? And so the way to look at this and the way to sort of set yourself some expectations is to look at recent relevant comparable sales in your area and try and steer your appraiser towards the valuation that you're looking for. So generally speaking, there's only a couple ways to really value your property. There's three ways, really. There's cost of replacement, which almost nobody ever uses. There's the income approach. So essentially, like, what rents are you now getting, and what could those rents support in terms of a monthly cost for that actual mortgage? And then looking at your own debt servicing ratios. And then finally, there's sort of the comparable sales approach. And generally speaking, when I'm looking for a appraisal, I'm going to put together a package for the appraiser detailing what renovations were actually done by us in order to force the appreciation of the building and improve its value, as well as some of the top and most favorable comparable sales that I can find in the market. So you may want to use a tool like House Sigma or Zoocasa or anything like that that would allow you to see recent relevant comparable sales in your neighborhood to use as a benchmark for valuation. And I don't think that it's well understood, but Matt, I'm sure you would echo this, that you can 100% influence the value of your appraisal by simply taking those steps. And Matt actually has another video that's really great on the Canadian Real Estate channel that I forgot to link here, but it's called Impress the Bank, right? And part of impressing the bank is essentially putting their attention on what you want them to see, right? So if there's 3 great sales in your area that you can find that's publicly available information, why not steer your appraiser to considering those as worthy of putting in his or her report, okay? And we've done this countless times. So if you steer their attention to a great comparable, they may just put it in their report and use that value, right? And I find more often than not, an appraiser is going to ask you what your target is. And if they don't ask, you still might as well tell them. There's no cost to telling them, hey, I'm looking to get 600,000 as the appraisal here, right? And the way this kind of works is that if you bought the property for 400,000 and you put in $50,000, but you renovated these things that we've listed here, bedrooms, bathrooms, landscaping, lighting, paint, it's probable that you will have added more than $50,000 of value. Okay, so that's how we're able to add 50,000 in strategic renos, but then maybe add $100,000 of value, perceived value to the actual building. And that can allow us, when we go to refinance the building at say 75 or 80% of the new valuation, to pull out a lot of our capital. Okay, a perfect BRRRR would mean that you pull out all of your capital, but that's not always possible. And honestly, I'm not sure that it should be expected either. But it is possible to recover a lot of your capital, if not all of your capital, by refinancing the project after you've got this increase in the actual rent that the building's collecting, as well as the valuation just based on the materials that are inside the building, right? So you've upgraded the kitchens, bathrooms, flooring, landscaping, lighting, paint. It's now worth more, right? And the way to look at this is from the lender's perspective. If you stop paying today, how can they market this property and sell it? Well, the only way for them to understand that is by looking at things that are selling in your area. So from the lender's perspective, they just want to know that you've got a great high quality property that they could, if they had to, power of sale and sell on the open market. What's the likelihood of that thing selling? Well, it depends on the finishes. It depends on the quality of the actual building in the neighborhood. So that's what they're going to be looking at. So set yourself up for success and do these strategic renovations that you can potentially pull all the capital back out. And that leads us to the next R, which is honestly probably the most important part of this strategy, is the repeat section. So there's a difference, at least in Canada. I can't speak to the US, although I think they do have like the 1031 exchange or whatever. But in Canada, if you sell a property, you're going to be taxed on that sale. Okay, there's the capital gains tax on that. But if you refinance a property, that's not a tax event because you've essentially just created more debt. So there's a couple of things to be aware of there. You've created more debt, right? Your payment is going to go up. If you've bought a property at 400,000, you refinance it at 600,000 and get 80% of that value, your actual debt has gone up, okay? Which means your payment is going to go up as well. So you have to be careful about that when you're refinancing. But when you go to refinance that thing, you're not taxed on that difference. You're able to pull it out and go and use it, but you're not going to be taxed on it, which means you get to keep 100% of those dollars to go and redeploy. And that is where the BRRRR strategy can be a really fantastic way to grow your net worth and grow your equity over time, right? And it's one of these ways that we're able to cash in on the situation that, like my grandparents, like I mentioned, they were able to buy this house at 160,000, but then they had to wait like 40 years to get access to that $1 million. Well, the BRRRR strategy allows us to build up that equity much faster in a repeatable fashion by just leveraging these strategic renovations and forced appreciation through increasing the rentability, the value, and the actual revenue generation of these buildings. So that's the BRRRR strategy kind of in a nutshell. Matt, is there something I missed here or anything you'd like to add to the conversation in terms of the BRRRR strategy?
I'll just give one little point of context here in regards to being able to pull out the proceeds from the refinance and use them. You can use them towards other investment strategies, right, without being taxed. If you were to use that personally, then you're going to end up like muddy in the water on the interest deductibility of that. So that's something just to keep in mind there. And again, like, you guys shouldn't be taking tax advice just off of a random
Yes.
YouTube video. So sit down with your accountant and really just get a thorough understanding of how to go about and implement it. It's not nearly as complicated as it sounds if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, but it's very easy for a new investor to accidentally misuse those proceeds and end up like bringing into question the tax deductibility of the interest on the debt, right? So on the new mortgage amount. So just a little FYI there. But again, I think the BRRRR investment strategy is one of the best investment strategies, particularly if you're focused on like the velocity of your money. And for a lot of new investors, particularly if you don't want to take on a lot of partners, this is one of the fastest paths, right, to growing your portfolio.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a couple of things that I pointed out in our article here on Substack that you may want to consider. One of the things is that, after you do all this stuff, you actually do need to operate the thing too. So I think maybe sometimes that gets overlooked. It's like, hey, I want to get rich, but it's like, okay, but now you've got this rental, right? And the BRRRR strategy is most effective, I would say, over a medium to a long term. So if you're looking to continue investing and repeating this process over time, I do think that you need to consider things like how are we going to collect the rent, right? Familiarizing yourself with local residential tenancy acts or any type of tenant law that you might have in your region. Maintenance of the building. Okay. So are you investing in your own city? Are you investing in another income city or another city that is perhaps far away from you? Who's going to do the maintenance? Because there will be maintenance, right? And I think a lot of people like to cite that 2 a.m. Plumbing call. I've never gotten one of those, to be honest with you, but I'm sure it does happen where it's like, oh, the toilet's overflowing and it's 2 a.m. Somebody's got to come fix this. Probably you want to have somebody in place for this, but that's part of networking and setting up that power team for yourself. There's also the possibility for this to go wrong, right? So if this goes wrong, you may have to do an eviction, right? Do you understand the laws of your area? Do you understand how to actually go about doing that and the necessary paperwork that you may have to file with, here we have the landlord tenant board, and we would have to follow a very specific process in order to get like a sheriff involved in order to do an eviction. And I think that it's important to just understand sort of the process of how we go through these motions in order to do things properly. Because if you're here in Ontario, the rules are extremely strict and they're very precise. And if you don't follow the precise rules to the letter, if say you're incorrect even by a single cent on the forms that you're filing to the LTB, it's possible for them to essentially throw out that hearing and say, no, you'll have to try this again with new paperwork that is correct. And the issue with that is it adds time, right? This may be a 3 to 12-month process. And that may sound scary, but this is a risk that we have to take on that accompanies the reward. And of course, in business, there's almost never any reward without risk. So it's definitely something that you want to consider. And then finally, one of the other things you may want to consider is the financial management. So there are mortgages that need to be paid, right? If you're going to continue doing this, you will have mortgages. Those mortgages also have terms and renewals. Okay, so making sure that you're prepared for those things by not setting yourself up for a failure. Failure when it comes to the mortgage world or the refinancing world may look like increasing your expenses right before that renewal, right? So if you go and buy that boat or you buy a car or you buy something else that's technically a liability right before you go to refinance, you may run into issues renewing your loans. Okay, so you definitely want to be aware of that. And like Matt said, consult your accountant, not us on this, but have a plan. And I think that's important for the BRRRR strategy, is just having that plan put together. You'll also have to be paying in some cases for the utilities, right? Like making sure that those things actually get paid on time so that you don't run into issues or unnecessary expenses. You can have things like repairs. Okay, have to save a little bit of money and set that aside for repairs and capital expenditure like roofs and furnaces, water leaks, things like that. And then taxes. I think a lot of people just kind of forget that, like, yeah, you're going to be paying the property taxes for these buildings. And so those are all some things to consider. But the other thing I would say, and just in addition to this, is it's very tempting to buy the cheapest building in what may be the worst neighborhood in the city. And I tried that out. So, and generally speaking, if you're talking to a real estate investor or somebody that's investing in this asset class, they're going to talk about things in terms of like an A-class neighborhood, right? Which may be like your new builds and sort of more affluent areas. There's like your B-class neighborhoods, which are arguably like maybe the best rental areas that aren't necessarily all going to be owned, but more so a rental type market where there's lots of employment around there. It's a safe neighborhood. It's clean. There's your C-class neighborhoods, which may be neighborhoods that are not quite the worst, but they're definitely not the best. And they're in transition into a B. Maybe there's new businesses popping up there. Look for craft breweries. They seem to pop up in your C-class neighborhoods. And then there's your D-class neighborhoods. And your D-class neighborhoods are like that street that everybody knows you don't go after dark, right? Where there's an increased police presence, where theft or assaults and things like that happen, or break-ins. And I would caution you against buying into those neighborhoods because they have an increased management and increased level of due diligence that needs to happen. And you've also got a limited after repair value. And after repair value is, of course, the state that we're trying to get to when we're in that refinancing stage of the BRRRR strategy. So I would caution against that. And if that means you have to wait a little bit to enter the real estate investing market, it might not be a bad thing because you're going to have a much better experience. Now, into flipping. I've certainly done a lot less flipping than I have anything else, but flipping is an interesting way to get a more active approach to investing. One of the challenges with the BRRRR strategy is that you are, generally speaking, always reinvesting your refinance proceeds. And so it's kind of like it's a way to gain a pile of equity, but you almost never gain liquidity. And that can be a challenge, right? Some people want to hold on to that cash. They want to have tangible money to hold on to, and they may take a more active approach to it. And so flipping is essentially another way of doing the BRRRR, except instead of a refinance at the end of it, you sell it, right? And typically vacant property is going to be more valuable, but we do actually want to do a lot of the same strategic renovations. Like, real estate is very formulaic. It's very boring. And quite often it's the same thing over and over again. So with flipping, you still want to do those strategic renos, bedrooms, bathrooms, flooring, landscaping, lighting, paint. It's just that instead of selling it to ourselves through an appraiser, we're going to sell it to the open market. And so with flipping, it becomes even more important to buy smart, and it becomes very important to understand the after repair value by looking at recent relevant comparable sales. The only thing I'll really add to flipping is that you may want to just consult with your accountant the best way to deal with some of the costs that you incur as you go about doing it. So you're going to have things that you need to have, like vehicles, tools, trailers, office space, marketing, advertising, office equipment, and other types of expenses and capital expenditures that you will have to talk to your accountant about. So make sure that if you're considering flipping, you have all these things laid out with your power team. The other thing with flipping is time is literally money. So like, one thing that a lot of people sort of ignore when it comes to a flip is they take heavily into consideration the time it will take to renovate the property up to the desired state of its highest and best use for a flip, but they often don't consider the time it will take to actually close the property. So just don't forget that while you're waiting for that property to close, more than likely it's vacant and staged, and you've got people doing walkthroughs and stuff, but it's not generating income, but it has all the same expenses, right? So don't forget that if you are going to do a flip, you still have mortgage payments every month. You still have taxes being paid every month. You still have utilities being paid every month. And you have just daily incidentals. So like, if you're going to that property all the time, you're going to be burning fuel on your vehicles. You're going to have depreciation. You're going to have interest expenses on any of your loans, right? Some of you may be using credit cards at the start to fund your to fund your projects, or you might be using a line of credit, or you might have borrowed the money privately. Or you might just be using your own cash, in which case I'd be thinking about opportunity cost, right? So there are these expenses that I think are often hidden costs to flipping, but you should really at least make a mental note of it, right? If you're going to be driving to this property every day and it's far away from your house, like there's real cost to that, including your time. So just make sure that you budget for that. And then the final little tip here I'll put for flipping would just be staging. Right now we're in a market, and this might not apply to every market, but right now we're in a market where days on market is up. The level of inventory is up a lot, and the average sale price is down significantly, right? So at the time of recording this, provincially at least, we're down about 20-25%, right, across the board. So properties are coming up for less and sitting for longer, and there's more of them, okay, which means we're in a highly competitive market that is skewed in the buyer's favor. So if you want to stand out as a seller right now and you're doing a flip, staging would be a great way to do that. You want to set yourself up for success as great as you can. And there's been a lot of innovation in the real estate market recently, and a lot of brokerages are actually now offering staging included in their fee, right? And so that might be something you may want to consider, is like, why are we paying for staging if our brokerage will stage it for us and try and capture the highest value included in their actual fees? And of course, we always want to consult with our entire power team when it comes to doing something lit, because everybody's going to have a different opinion on the market cycles and timing the market. And I just need to tell you right now, it's very hard to time the market because it is one of the things that's outside of your control. You can maximize your chances of success by doing the strategic renovations and leveraging tools like staging to help make your property more marketable. But that doesn't mean market will respond the way that your lawyer thinks, right? Or your mortgage agent or your realtor. It's very hard to tell where the market's going to go. And things like we've seen in the market, like inflation and rising interest rates and conflicts internationally and supply chain interruptions and employment interruptions, those things all have effects that you can't control. So I would just say, if you're going to do this, make sure that you're covered. And one of the other ways to cover yourself is to have exit strategies. Okay, if you're doing a flip, you should have strategies available to you that if the market changes while you're in the course of doing this flip, that you can actually keep the property and do something else with it. So you might go from a flip to a BRRRR, right? Or you might go from a flip to a short-term rental, or you might go from a flip to a rent to own or something like that. So there's lots of ways to pivot in these strategies. And so there's lots of ways to cover ourselves for risk. And Matt, do you have anything that you want to add to flips before I move on?
No, again, I think it just comes down to your priorities as an investor, right? So understanding what you're really trying to accomplish. Is it a lump sum amount of money, or are you looking for consistent, relatively more passive income? And that'll often help guide you towards whatever's the right strategy for yourself.
Awesome. And then finally, and Matt just mentioned a word, they're passive. A lot of people, and I'll offer up that these are probably the three most common strategies, right? The BRRRR strategy is just like you're going to buy this thing, rent it, and keep it. The flip strategy is like you're going to buy it and fix it up and sell it. And then another way to participate in real estate investing is by actually becoming the lender, right? But I think there's a misconception that this is actually a passive strategy. I don't think any of these things are ever truly passive. I think you need to have a decent amount of wherewithal and cognition around these things. So with lending, I would argue that it's probably the most passive of these strategies, but it's definitely not, it's not passive at all, because you do still need to have an understanding of what's going on in these projects, and you still need to manage yourself prudently. So a couple of things that you're going to want to do is, if you have experience in underwriting deals, and by underwriting, I just simply mean analyzing deals, that would be very helpful. But when it comes to lending, like perhaps you either don't have the team right now that you would want in order to start renovating and actually doing a project. Perhaps you want to learn from somebody that's already doing projects. Or perhaps you you have no desire at all in ever doing a project, but you just want to put your money to work. And lending is a great way that you can participate in real estate investing without actually having to buy a property or have to run a project. So, one of the things I would really want to take into consideration here is like, do you understand the cost of renovations? Okay, because there's a tendency, I think, for people to underestimate the cost of their renovations and the amount of time that it will take. So as a lender, it would be very useful if you can understand the actual scope of the project that somebody's pitching you and understand the cost of it, what it will take, how long it will take, and what the likelihood is that they'll execute on that based on their previous experience. You should also have a good understanding of the neighborhood and market of the subject property. So if somebody's pitching you a market that you've never heard of and a neighborhood that you don't know at all, just understand that it's probably a much higher risk investment for you than investing in your own backyard. Like for us in London, where I currently live, London, Ontario, like big difference between living on the west side of Adelaide Street and living on the east side of Adelaide Street. But if you didn't live here, I would never expect you to understand that difference, right? One field, the other neighborhood is Old East Village, but those are two different things completely when it comes to after repair value. Even though on the west side of the street, the address might be 1082, and on the east side of the street, it might be 1080. But those values are completely different. And so you have to take that into consideration when you're doing your lending is like, do you actually understand that market? And what are the implications of the neighborhood and house that you're actually investing in? Another thing I wanted to draw to your attention is the 5 C's of credit. So there's capacity, character, capital, collateral, and conditions. Capacity can be described as essentially their ability to pay you back. So does the person that's looking to borrow money from you actually have income, employment income, rental income? Does this project actually look like it's going to work, right? Character is their ability to demonstrate creditworthiness. So things like a credit report can be handy, but honestly doesn't paint the full picture. I would look at, have they got a great reputation in the business? Have they borrowed from other people that you know in the past? Have they done successful projects in the past? Have they been doing this for a while, right? Do they have experience in this? Capital, what's their skin in the game, right? It's generally speaking more risky to lend to somebody that has no incentive to run the project on time, on budget, and on scope. So you want there to be consequences, right? If they don't actually execute on this project. And often one of the best ways to have consequences is to have them have their own money at risk as well as yours, right? And what that might look like is they have 20% down, you're staking 80%. Or if you're doing a private loan to them, you still want them to have money in as a down payment or as a renovation budget. Collateral, so that's the actual security that you have as the lender. So generally speaking, if you're going to be the lender, there's escalations of risk depending on how risky you want to be. And with those escalation come very different rewards. So generally speaking, like in the past, I've lent money unsecured at 15 to 20%, which would be like the highest risk category of loan that you could do. Because unsecured means that if they sell the building or they do the flip or don't sell the building, there's not really any legal paper trail or contract that is going to enforce them to have to pay you back. And that's different than having something like a second position or a first position mortgage, where it's registered to the title of the building, where if they actually sell the building, they will be legally obligated to pay you back the money that you've lent plus any interest and fees, right? So in second position, I've lent and borrowed at 8 to 15%. And in first position, I've seen anything from 3 to 10%. I've never lent in first position myself. And so with those different positions, what those really mean is in second position, if the building sells, the first position is paid back first and then the second position. So if you're in a situation like today where the value of buildings have dropped since January or February, anywhere from 20 to 30%, you may have actually broken the threshold depending on the loan to value that you had. So if you were in second position and you were leveraged up to 90% loan to value, you actually might be down 10% at this point, and the first position will be paid back first. So there is what's called credit risk associated to lending as you go further down sort of the totem pole from first to second to unsecured. So, and of course, there is a corresponding reward built into that. So something to think about. The other thing to think about when it comes to lending as a strategy is most of the money, I would say, or at least when I've been doing this, has been made on the actual fees. Okay, so when we're thinking about a loan, say a second position mortgage, and it's going to collect anywhere from 8 to 15% per year, assigning a lender fee to that of 1 to 2% flat on the lump sum that gets charged every time the loan is issued will result in a much larger total proceeds from the loan. So ideally, you would loan in second position. For my case, it was ideal for me. So I'm not giving you investment advice here, but I was, in my case, most optimal when I was lending in second position at say 15% with a 2% lender fee and lending that out twice per year, because you're capturing that lump sum of interest on your principal twice per year, regardless of whether you lend it out and they pay you back in 1 month or 6 months, right? So you want to collect that lender fee as often as possible, but just understand that the greater your lender fee, probably the greater the risk in the actual investment. And so that can change your willingness or desire to enter that. And you also want to be sure to include NSF fees, any other fees to deter unwanted extensions or late payments. There should be consequences to not paying you back on time or not paying you on time, right? Rent's due on the first. Lots of different ways to structure these loans. Definitely you want to consult your lawyer. Definitely you want to consult an accountant. And often a decent way to place these loans would be through an actual mortgage agent, right? Where they can just place them with highly qualified people. So those are 3 of the ways that you could easily make money in real estate. Well, easily is maybe a stretch, but simply, right? These things are repeatable. They're not that hard. Most of the information would be available to you online in terms of, like, you know, how to install flooring. There's probably a million videos on YouTube about how to do that. And so a great place to start, I've linked it below in the resources on the Substack article, would be the Canadian Real Estate channel. There's tons of videos there, right? Hundreds of videos about real estate investing. I've also linked a couple of videos there from Bigger Pockets, which is a often cited resource that real estate investors will use, both in Canada and the US, and a few other resources there available to you. So definitely want to check that out. And I hope that this video was useful in at least being a starting point to, you know, the discoverability if you want to continue looking into the BRRRR strategy or flipping or even lending itself. I hope that this helped give you some context as to what's available to you. Matt, anything to add here on real estate investing?
No, obviously, you know, for anyone that really wants to get into it, it's just a matter of committing yourself to the learning process and understanding, like everything in life, it's a iterative process. So again, just appreciate you sharing with us, Adam, the first iteration here for people that maybe are newer to the idea and want to open up their horizons.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we could spend probably 10 hours just unpacking any one of these strategies. So obviously in a 1-hour video, this is definitely an introduction to the concepts, but yeah, tons of resources available to you. And I've linked several below on this article, and that's all we have for you today. And tomorrow we're going to be getting, tomorrow we're going to be getting into some personal development tips and tricks, I believe. So I think Matt and I are going to share with you guys some of the things that we found to be useful, and just some tips and tricks for you guys that might help you on a daily basis to help get 1% better every day. And that's, again, sort of the purpose of this channel. So I'm definitely looking forward to that tomorrow.
The same. Again, just kind of think of it as a grab bag, just the things we found most useful on our personal development journey.
Awesome, you guys. Well, we will see you back tomorrow for that. And in the meantime, please like, subscribe, share the channel, get some more people out here. We're in the pursuit of having the best day ever, and it's always better with friends. So I hope you guys will share that along. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.